Great, and welcome back, everyone. And for those that are just joining now, welcome to this workshop. This second session is about building a more resilient, sustainable, and transparent clinical trial enterprise. And our objectives are to discuss key priority challenges and opportunities related to a resilient, sustainable, and transparent clinical trial enterprise. We're going to have two 12-minute talks. I know you all are very familiar with the two speakers. Please enter your thoughts, if you want, directly into the Q&A box under the webcast window or in Slack at clinicaltrials2030.slack.com if you would like to, not required. Our first speaker is Elliott. Levy, Senior Vice President, R&D Strategy and Operations at Amgen. I'm not supposed to introduce people, but I'm going to give very, very quick comments. Elliott has decades of experience in academia at Bristol Myers Squibb and at Amgen, but most notably in the last year, he took the lead at pivoting our global development and global development operations in response to COVID, and also led Amgen's participation in key collaborations across industry and government to study anti-inflammatory drugs against COVID. Dr. Woodcock, I know we all know, she has decades of experience as our top drug regulator in the United States. Notably, in the last year, she led the part of the Operation Warp Speed that has brought multiple monoclonal antibodies to the market that are being used as we speak to keep COVID patients out of the hospital and help them get better. And very, very recently was named acting commissioner of FDA. And I know I speak for many people here in thinking that there could not be a better person to lead the agency during this difficult period. So with that, let's go ahead and start with Elliott. Thank you, Elliott.
Great, thank you so much. And Melvin, you can show my slides. It's a true pleasure to be here and to present the perspective of the medical product development industry. I'm approached my talk this morning with a great deal of optimism around the potential to transform the clinical research enterprise to better meet the needs of all participants. And if we just go to the next slide, just want to emphasize that though I work for Amgen and I've worked with many companies over the years, that the opinions that I present in this talk are emphatically my own. Can we go to the next slide? So as I think about it, choose to focus on the what I think are probably three groups that have the greatest stake in the clinical research enterprise: sponsors, patients, and societies. And each of these groups have their own distinct perspective. Industry has been focused for the past decades on improving the speed, efficiency, and success rates of clinical trials. But fundamentally, clinical research is conducted not for the benefit of the funder, but for the patient. And the institution of clinical research can thrive only when it's perceived to be of benefit to the societies where it is conducted, the societies that bear the cost of healthcare and the burdens of disease, and that allow us the extraordinary privilege of conducting research on human subjects. Now, I think in the past that to some extent the interests of these three groups have been perceived to be differentiated and to some extent in conflict with one another, such that the interests of one could only be satisfied through sacrificing the interests of the other. In my view, what the pandemic taught us, among other things, is that a greater focus on the needs of patients and societies is in fact consistent with the industry's needs for greater efficiency and productivity. And therefore, we can transform the clinical research enterprise in a way that benefits all parties, including industry funders. So if I could have the next slide, I'm going to just walk through now the perspectives of each of these groups and contrasting the current and the desired future state. Today, industry looks at clinical research and sees a high risk and costly enterprise with long-term trends in terms of complexity and cost that generally point in the wrong direction. As a result, the return on biopharmaceutical investment is low and falling. And since the ability to raise prices is rapidly disappearing, the investment model for biopharmaceutical development is viable only in an environment like ours where capital is abundant and cheap. The steps that we have to take to improve the future state are well known, and they must be applied with increasing discipline and energy. The starting point is continuous process improvement, which is an essential practice in any successful industry. Process improvement may only yield improvements in efficiency of 3 to 5% per year, but these improvements can become quite significant if they're reproduced annually and compound over time. And these changes benefit patients by eliminating unnecessary study procedures and reducing site workload, allowing the site staff to concentrate more on the patient than the process. Platform trials, adaptive designs, and placebo substitution, methods which maximize the meaningful data produced by each patient, can produce efficiencies of 20 to 40%. And these methods benefit patients by reducing the likelihood of being assigned to an ineffective comparator, and in the case of certain platform trials, by increasing the likelihood of being assigned to a therapy tailored to the patient's particular disease characteristics. Trial simplification can yield savings of 50% or more in certain selected settings, and substitution of real-world evidence for clinical trials can yield the most dramatic savings. Substitution of real-world data for clinical trial data is rare today, but there are successful examples, and I expect there will be more as we gain familiarity and confidence in using real-world data over the next decade. These methods also serve patients by reducing the burden of trial participation, and societies by increasing the volume of decision-enabling data available to healthcare systems. Could I have the next slide? I think it's also become apparent now that in addition to these well-established methods, data and technology will have a profound impact on the speed, efficiency, and success of clinical research over the next decade. Data and technology will also reduce the burden of trial participation, increase the probability of benefit, assist us in increasing diverse representation in trials, and increase the volume, reliability, and relevance of clinical trial results for societal funders. The vast amounts of real-world data from healthcare settings that are now available to us will allow us to better understand patient characteristics and standard of care. As a result, we'll be able to make the enrollment period, always the longest and least predictable phase of any study, shorter and more predictable by refining eligibility criteria, selecting sites with larger numbers of potential subjects and with patients with the diverse characteristics that we seek, and through better alignment between the protocol and local standards of care. Another type of data that's also becoming abundant, genomic data, can also have a profound impact on clinical research. We're at the threshold of applying readily available patient-level genomic data to select patients whose genetic background makes them likely to enjoy an outsized therapeutic benefit. This will allow trials to be smaller and faster and more certain. It will also increase the likelihood of benefit for the patient and the value of clinical research for the society. Proteomics is also now emerging as another powerful tool which can be used in conjunction with genomics to select those patients most likely to benefit from an intervention. Improved analytics will have a dramatic impact as well. The medical literature is too vast for us to perform systematic reviews on more than a small fraction of the questions that are relevant to clinical research. And as a result, our research questions and study designs are not as well informed as they could be. Artificial intelligence and machine learning can reduce the time required to perform a high-quality systematic review from months to days or hours. This will allow us to refine and improve the quality of our research inquiries and increase success rates. AI and machine learning will also play an increasingly important role in screening incoming clinical trial data, particularly safety data, for important signals. And finally, new approaches to data collection, including passive data collection through wearable devices, will reduce the burden of data collection for both patient and sponsor and provide access to enormous new data sets from which novel and meaningful endpoints can be derived. While the number of parameters that can be assessed by wearables today is small, their scope and capabilities are likely to increase steadily over the next decade. While data extracted from the medical record will also supplement and in some cases substitute for data collected through the case report form. Melvin, if we could just skip the next two slides in the interest of time. One more. Okay, let me just go directly to the patient perspective. Today, patient access to clinical trials is limited and participation can be burdensome. And while trial participation carries no guarantee of benefit, patients do want to maximize their chance of receiving some benefit. In the future, patients will routinely participate in the design of clinical trials, and those trials will use methods for remote conduct which predated the pandemic, but were tested and found valid during the pandemic. These trials will be conducted closer to the patient, community settings to a much greater extent than today. And all these changes, which are made in the interest of patients, will also benefit sponsors by improving recruitment, retention, and data quality. Innovative methods I mentioned a few minutes ago, including adaptive designs and platform trials, as means to address sponsor imperatives, will also benefit patients by eliminating non-informative testing, allowing termination of trials when the research question has been answered, and maximizing the likelihood of a patient receiving an effective therapy. And finally, the probability of benefit from trial participation and overriding concern for patients will be increased by these methods, as well as the use of genomics and proteomics. If we could go to the next slide. Just want to give you an example of how at Amgen, one sponsor, but much like others, how we think about the involvement of patients in the entire continuum of drug development, starting from the earliest phases, working in a disease area. Patients help us to identify where unmet need resides. As product candidates emerge, patients help us to determine what attributes the product will need to possess in order to be attractive to them. They help us to design the studies, to interrogate dosing regimens, which will be easy for them to live with, to help us to decide what outcomes to measure, and finally to help us bring forward data sets that are compelling to regulators and payers. Can I have the next slide, please? I want to touch for a moment on the experience, direct experience the pandemic had in the adoption of remote methods. In areas hard hit by the pandemic, sites focused exclusively on caring for patients already enrolled in clinical trials. And in many cases, neither the patient nor the sponsor personnel were able to visit the site, which compelled us to adopt or increase the use of remote trial conduct methods. And this graphic illustrates one sponsor's qualitative impression of the adoption and impact of these various approaches. We saw widespread adoption of telemedicine, remote and statistical monitoring, and shipment of investigational product direct to patients. There was also significant adoption of home health care and local collection of lab and imaging data. The effort required to deploy these approaches was generally acceptable. These methods made it possible for us to keep patients in the study, treated safely, and to collect all the required study data. And while it's too early to fully assess the impact of these methods on study quality, the early indicators are that quality was not affected. Can I have the next slide? We also, I think, have a major opportunity to increase the participation of community centers. This slide just simply represents our experience as one company over the last 5 years, where the majority of our sites are still academic sites. Even though they are, of course, not the majority of venues for provision of care in the United States or where most patients reside. So clearly a major opportunity exists to increase the participation of community sites. Can I have the next slide? And finally, I want to just touch on the perspective of society. I think today, healthy competition between self-interested parties is seen as the primary driver for the creation of innovative medicines and medical and scientific value. A byproduct of this model with competition at the center is that data is defined by default as proprietary and public only by exception. The pandemic changed the incentives and opened the doors to wider sharing of data and other proprietary information. And one example is the public posting of the major vaccine trial protocols, an action which would have been unthinkable before, but seems to have had no adverse consequences for the sponsors and increased public trust in the studies and the vaccines themselves. Today, we also recognize that our trials often fail to enroll sufficient numbers of minority participants with unique healthcare needs, particularly African Americans, for whom under-participation in clinical trials is a problem with deep historical roots. The pandemic brought added attention to the issue of diverse trial populations, with data on minority participation in the vaccine trials regularly disclosed for public consideration and extensively discussed. And we should acknowledge that limited access to trials only aggravates the issue of minority participation. And a last and extremely important issue is the concentration of biopharmaceutical investment in a shrinking number of disease areas where the incentives are strongest, and a shrinking level of investment in some of the most important human diseases where disincentives to investment are prevalent. And with more and more money invested in diseases that affect fewer and fewer people, the benefit of biopharmaceutical innovation to society becomes less apparent, which erodes trust. Now, these problems, if addressed, represent a major opportunity for improvement in the value delivered to societies and the trust placed in the institution of clinical research. And they also offer industry the opportunity to increase productivity and patients the opportunity to benefit more from trial participation. So I would start with a reset of the balance between collaboration and competition, retaining the critical incentives to innovation associated with the discovery and characterization of specific product candidates, while expanding the scope of pre-competitive collaboration and data sharing, recognizing that the benefits of sharing may be substantial and the adverse impact on incentives too small to consider. Similarly, expanding the realm of data sharing could be a benefit, and I'll point out a few examples. Clinical trial diversity can be increased. We already know how. What is most needed is simply the will and the discipline to systematically apply existing methods. And similarly, the disproportionate investment in a few disease areas as a result of market distorting incentives could be improved if the incentive system were modified. And the final and most important lesson from the pandemic is that public trust will flow if we behave in a more transparent fashion and if we continue to develop medicines that address the most prevalent public health needs. So just if we go to the last slides, the next slide, please. I just want to point out a few examples of collaboration that were notable. One was the COVID R&D Alliance, which sprang up spontaneously in March, diverse membership across the sector. This group has launched the first industry-sponsored platform trial, to my knowledge, the community trial, to study repurposed COVID-19 therapeutics. It launched a platform that screened over 3,000 preclinical candidates and identified a number of hits for further progression. It's pooled real-world data and analytics to accelerate the development of real-world insights into the disease, and it's working on plans for long-term pandemic preparedness. If we have the next slide, another organization that demonstrated the value of collaboration was TransCelerate, the collaborative formed in 2012 by the largest biopharmaceutical companies to improve the conditions of clinical research. And what TransCelerate did most notably was to stand up a platform where patient-level data from both comparator and experimental arms on COVID trials could be posted and made available to researchers to assist them in designing the next generation of trials and refining eligibility criteria and optimizing endpoints for assay sensitivity. And if I could just go to the next slide, just to illustrate graphically the need for greater investment in common diseases. This is a graphic developed by McKinsey, which groups compounds in clinical development by disease area and plots them on the y-axis versus the remaining disease burden in those areas, and the x-axis, the x-axis and the y-axis by the total number of compounds. And it's readily apparent that there's a huge remaining disease burden in cardiovascular, psychiatric, and neurologic diseases and relatively little investment. This, again, is a fixable problem, but it will take an all-of-society effort. So if we go to the final slide, I'll just begin where I started. I have an optimistic view for the future. I think that the interests of the different major stakeholder communities here are not in conflict with one another, that they are aligned and mutually reinforcing. The pandemic brought this home to us in a very clear way, and it creates an opportunity for us to envision a clinical research enterprise where the focus on patients and societal goods accelerates the delivery of new therapeutics. And I'll stop there.